G'day, it's Justin here, and thanks for joining me for another bonus bit as we look back on the Easterfest and Australian Gospel Music Festivals. I was stoked that Claire Hazzard agreed to be part of this project because she was one of the artists who was leading the charge in the independent Christian music scene throughout Australia in the late 90s and early 2000s. Claire's a Queensland artist who cut her teeth on the Brisbane music scene before signing to indie label CW Media, releasing her debut album The Goodness and Severity, and eventually relocating to Melbourne. Through those early years, Claire picked up a stack of national airplay and toured across Australia with acts like the Paul Colman Trio. I hope you enjoy my chat with Claire and stay tuned to the end because Claire brought her guitar into the studio and treats us with a special live acoustic performance.
My name is Claire Hazzard and I am a singer-songwriter. Me and a guitar is the only way I've ever done that. And over the years I've toured parts of Australia and I've sung across the Christian music festivals that were quite big in the 90s and the early 2000s. I think in total I've made 7 albums. And now I do none of it. But I'm here to talk about it.
Okay, so I know we're talking about stuff from like 25 plus years ago in some cases.
And it's good you got me now because very soon I think the memories will all be completely erased. So maybe there's some left right now.
Okay, so can you take me back to the late 90s, how you got your start in music and what, I guess, the Christian music scenes in Brisbane and in Melbourne looked like for you?
Yeah, so it was probably more mid and early 90s for me. I was studying education in Brisbane and a couple of my friends mixed in music circles and they heard some of the songs I'd been writing just in my bedroom at home, and said, these are great, we need to show them to our friends Dave and Nikki Gray, who I hadn't met and had just launched a small independent record label, CW Media. So I remember going around to Dave and Nikki's house and I felt pretty nervous, but I sat on the couch with my guitar and I sang to them and they said, we have to sign you. And I didn't think much about it. I thought, okay, I'll sign a record deal. And I did. And Dave took on the role not only of helping coordinate recording on my first album, which was done here in Brisbane, but he also took on quite a managerial role for me. And before I knew it, I was booked in to sing at Groundswell. So those were the days of Groundswell and it was so exciting. There was such an energy in Brisbane at that time around Christian bands that were floating around like Rhubarb. And I remember them particularly because I loved their music. And I was thrown into that mix. I was suddenly this little artist on a stage with a guitar. Yeah, and those years flew by very fast and they were hectic. I did do an education degree, so I actually moved up into central Queensland and began teaching. And so music took a back seat for a while. But it didn't take long before I started travelling around Australia just for the sake of travel, not for music, but ended in Melbourne. And I think in hindsight, God was in that because what happened in Melbourne was Dave Gray, who was still back here in Brisbane, said to me, hey, I've got a connection with this musician. He was only emerging at the time. His name's Paul Colman. And how about I try and connect you up with him? He might have some, helpful things down in Melbourne for you. So knowing nothing, and at the time Paul Colman wasn't particularly known, made this connection. And Paul said, oh, yeah, come around, come play me some of your songs. So I remember going around to their house. I think they lived in Nunawading, and there I was again on another couch with my guitar singing to someone. It was really fun. And Paul, at the end of singing a few songs, said to me, you're coming on tour with the trio. I want you to be my support act. And so Paul had been just a solo artist, but had got himself together a trio. So that was Phil Gordian on drums and Grant Norsworthy on bass. Really amazing men and talented musicians themselves also. They were a great, I want to say pairing. What do you call it? Tripling? Because not just musically did they sync, but their personalities were such a beautiful balance. Phil is such a calm, steady, warm personality, and then Paul's got his more in-your-face, spiky personality, which I love. Paul's a good friend.
I remember Paul saying to me, he said, Phil must have been so patient because he was such a good drummer. He was like this studio session player who we got in, and we'd tell him to do these drum fills. Okay, Phil, play it like this. Do, 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 do. And Phil would very patiently just, play it exactly as they said.
I think Paul's understating that. Paul can be, he was very directive, you're right. And Phil is profoundly talented, like a walking metronome, but with flair. And yes, I agree. I think Phil must have been very patient. But then I think all three of them were very patient with me because off we went on tour, and Adam Lester was on that tour as well. So he was coming in for they'd do an acoustic set and then they'd do their band set, Paul would get out the electric guitar and they'd get Adam up, and he was playing all of his amazing Adam Lester stuff that Adam does. We toured most of the east coast of Australia and across sort of into the south of Victoria, and we went to Adelaide. We went to Adelaide and parts of South Australia. So it was a pretty long tour, and it was quite an eye-opener. I think it was my first time ever on the road. And in there, Paul had said, hey, I reckon you should just get my sound guy to hit record every night when you're up on stage, and you might end up with a live album out of it. And that certainly did come out of that. So I was able to get enough content across the tour to put out live and transparent. And I must have already released... I had released my self-titled EP just prior to that. So that had Finest Unreliable Friend, The Field, a few of the key songs that for me in Christian radio went to number one in Australia. In Love With You and Finest Unreliable Friend both spent time at number one.
What did touring, and I guess I'm thinking specifically in those days before social media. So how important was touring, radio play, and on top of that, festival appearances like, late 90s, early 2000s before we get smartphones and social media?
Well, it was the lifeblood of music. If you didn't get up on a stage in front of people and tour, you didn't sell albums. And I mean physical stock. So you would have these big boxes that would fit 100 CDs, and you'd have to put them in the trucks and take them everywhere with you. You had to have a float, you had to have change, you had a black to cover the table, and somebody had to be there. And that is when you sold music. There was no downloading, there was no streaming, there was no social media. People would hear you on the radio, then they'd find out, they're coming to town, let's go and have a listen. They'd pay for a ticket, and then hopefully if they liked you, they'd come buy an album at the end of the night. And those were the days when you were standing there and signing albums with a Sharpie. So if you don't play, you don't sell. And that's how it worked. And I've never been involved in the music industry in the era of social media and streaming services.
What about AGMF? So that AGMF starts in 1999. Did you play the first one?
Someone was asking me that because, funnily, I've just come from Toowoomba this weekend gone, and I think I did.
Because I know definitely 2000, I found old programs and flyers and posters and stuff.
Yep.
Definitely 2000. But in the early 2000s, how key was something like AGMF, and it was still small, but it was growing. Like, how key was that to, your development as an artist?
Yeah, so it's interesting. It was more key than I had any idea about at the time. So I just remember this guy named Isaac Moody somehow contacting me and saying, hey, there's a festival, would you come and sing? And to me it was just another invitation to sing somewhere. I didn't understand, but maybe he didn't either what it was going to become at that point. So I said yes. And I remember beginning at the AGMF and being overwhelmed with the size of it. And funnily, as you know, it really wasn't that big at the start, but it felt big. It was bringing together pockets of Christian music. So there was a little Brisbane scene. Then I believe there was a little Sydney scene, though I had nothing to do with it, but around the Black Stump and everything. And then there was the Melbourne scene, which was a bit bigger. And really a lot of that centred around Paul and the Paul Colman Trio at that time, but he was by no means the only artist down there.
It's Compliments of Gus.
Yeah, so Compliments of Gus were on the rise, and I'm still, to this day, good friends with Jared and Beck. And they're still doing a lot of great work in the music scene down there, but behind the scenes now. They're not doing a band of their own. So I think none of us understood how important the Australian Gospel Music Festival would become in our lives and in what we were doing. And, yeah, I remember the first few years the stages for me were small and the audiences were relatively small, compared to where it ended up. But what was happening is that in one place, a few things. You had people from a lot of parts of Australia, or at least the East Coast. People would come for this festival. So it was killing a lot of birds with one stone. You were getting a lot of exposure. But the other thing that happened too was the networking with other artists, and it began to connect artists from Sydney and from Melbourne and from Brisbane. It was a really amazing time. So in hindsight, I think it was one of the biggest engines driving not just my journey as an artist, but a lot of our journeys.
You spoke of that connection with other artists. What about connection with other people in the business? Did you find that it was easy to maybe get more radio airplay, which was key, or maybe meet other people who are booking shows? Hey, let's book Claire Hazzard for our church, or was it that kind of thing as well?
Absolutely. It just was a sort of a self-generating PR exercise without even trying. So yes, a lot of people from radio would approach me and throughout the weekend saying, can I grab you for interviews? So the weekend, it's funny, I was just talking to a lady yesterday in Toowoomba about the AGMF, and she said, oh, it was so fun, wasn't it? And I remember, I thought, no, it was hard work. You didn't go to the festival for fun, you worked. So you sang and you interviewed, and you sang and you interviewed, and then you were fanned out to sing at churches on the Sunday. And back at the time up Margaret Street, there were sort of little additional stages. So yes, a lot of radio contact and connection, which obviously would have then fed into more radio play, I think. And yes, a lot of people would approach you and say, hey, I've got a festival coming up at this location at this time. Absolutely, it was a one-stop shop, the AGMF. And look, in hindsight, I guess it was a lot of fun, but I do know it was also just a lot of hard work as an artist.
Do you have some favourite memories?
I do. I have an incredible memory. One year it had got a lot bigger, and I know that I was singing at a ticketed event in, maybe it was called the Big Top. I think it was about 600 people would fit in there, and they had paid specifically to see several artists through that night, and I was one of them. And I was staying in Toowoomba in preparation for that, of course. And by then I wasn't doing the smaller gigs. You would often just do one and show up for that. And I had no voice, Justin.
Oh, no.
No, and when I say no voice, I'm not stretching language. I couldn't speak. And so I was doing all of the things in the day or two leading up, drinking all the juices and the
hot teas.
I was doing everything. But look, it wasn't getting any better. And I had a decision to make, and I had to make it fairly soon. And I remember getting on my knees and saying, Lord, I've come all this way. People have paid to see me. This is what you've called me to, but I've got no voice. I need you to sort this. What do I do? And crystal clear, not audibly, but in my heart, I just heard the words, do you trust me? And I said, well, yeah, but when I say I said it, I thought it. I couldn't say it. I prayed in my heart, of course I trust you, but come on, I can't get on a stage without a voice. And just back again came, do you trust me? It's the most terrifying thing I've ever done. I said, all right.
So you walked out there.
I got up on stage, unable to speak. Nothing. When I opened my mouth with all of my will, nothing would come out. And you know what's interesting? So my friends Jared and Beck from Compliments of Gus were at that show, and so they'd heard me sing hundreds of times, because by then I think I was living in Melbourne and in that scene. I don't know what happened. I'll never know. I just started to play and I opened my voice, and not only could I sing, but there was so much power in my voice that I'd never even heard or felt. And I did the whole set with no trouble. I sang and I sang and I sang. And I know I didn't make that up because that extra feeling of strength and capacity in my voice, because I remember coming down off the stage and thinking, I've got to get out of here. I can't talk to people, because my voice just stopped again as soon as I got off the stage. But Jared raced up to me, having heard me sing 100 times, and he said to me, Hazzard, what was going on with your voice tonight? I've never heard your voice sound that good.
Wow.
Yeah. And I felt that was a real confirmation that, this was God stepped in, and I'll never, and you know what? So many situations in my life, 20 years ago, I suppose that probably was, I faced these impossible situations and I just remember these words, do you trust me? And I've seen him come through.
Every time you maybe walk through something difficult in the future, you can think back to that moment on stage.
I do. I think of climbing those stairs, knowing I've got no voice, thinking, what kind of an idiot am I about to look like? But it was all there. Wow. It was more than there. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yes.
Look, over the last, 10 years, the Australian music landscape, I guess, has changed dramatically, and we've lost tons of festivals. And you've spoken a little bit about some of the impacts that something like AGMF, later Easterfest, had on your career as a singer and a songwriter. What do you see? We lose all these festivals, we lose all these opportunities. It's difficult for live music venues to even operate. These days we went through a pandemic, which was devastating for the industry. How hard is it for the next Claire Hazzard, who's sitting in her bedroom writing songs on her guitar? How difficult is it for a young musician now with less opportunity to get out there and play, even with all the social media stuff that we have? Do you see that the loss of these things is a detriment to the industry?
I think it's bigger than that, but yes, is a short answer. So I think our entire culture, since social media and smartphones, has entirely changed. You had to go out to listen to music. Okay, you could buy a CD, but you probably had to go out to buy it. And you met people. You were in community. You were surrounded by a culture. We now have become so insulated. We can live our lives from home. We can even work from home in a lot of cases. Children can school from home. We're getting our music on our smartphones. We're listening with earbuds or headphones. It's all a shut down. So music used to draw you out of your world into a bigger world. But now music is a place where you can hide away in your bedroom and you can stream endless hundreds of thousands of artists from around the globe. I know I was reflecting on the fact that my kids, they're in their late teens and early 20s, their playlists are full of thousands of songs. Well, we could never have had that many songs. You couldn't afford that many CDs. And they don't particularly know who these artists are by and large. There may be a couple of standouts, but you'll just hear a song and think, oh, I like it, and you add it to your list and you pay no attention to who that artist is. I think there's just such a tidal wave of music now because of the home studio, the ability to make music, really high quality music using software at home. It's all gone inward. So not only are you competing against a far broader range of artists to be heard, but when you are heard, you're just in a mix and you probably don't have a lot of meaning to someone. I know that a lot of people would approach me and they felt that they knew me because I'd listen to my songs, and my songs in particular were quite hard on sleeve. Some of them I look back and think, oh, glory, I can't believe I wrote that. But that's where I was, people felt that they knew you as an artist and they wanted to tell you their story and how God used that song to speak to me in this part of my life. And I'm availed myself. I learned as an artist to respect that and make myself available to people for hearing their stories. I didn't always understand that early, but later on I did. Here's what I would say, though, to any artist, young artist who's called to sing, you just have to be obedient. You know, I never had a plan. I just picked up my guitar and started writing, and God brought all of those pieces together, the Dave and Nikki Gray, and then Melbourne, and then Paul Colman and the trio and the tour, and then Isaac probably found me via that tour exposure, I'd say, and then the AGMF. And God will do something. If he's calling you to it, be faithful and do it. How will he do that, and how will he expose you to the listeners he wants hearing your music? I don't know. You don't know. It doesn't matter. I didn't know back then, and you don't need to know right now. You just have to obey.
Yeah.
Write the songs you're called to write. Don't be scared to say what you actually need to say in a song.
Last question. So then just piggybacking off of that, would you say that something like the AGMF, Easterfest, is as much about community as it was about the music? At
least as much. And looking back with that big picture hindsight, I think more. You know, I forget a lot of the songs I played and heard, but I don't forget the people and the connections, and I still have some of those connections in my life, and they're really valuable. So yes, I think that Christian music needs community. Well, we need community. Humans, the human endeavour needs community, don't we? Mm. So yes, Easterfest was a crucial, and I would say it was the pivotal festival. I did end up playing at Black Stump as the years went by, and they were great, and I'm not minimising those, but there was something about Easterfest, and I think God had his hand on that. Yeah, I think he did. Okay, Claire, you've brought your guitar in. What are you going to play for us? This is called Turning Point. Do, 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 do. Do, 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 do. I've been out at sea, it's a mystery, but I always thought we'd make it home somehow. Till I looked around, and that's when I found we had come too far to go back now. Falling to my knees, begging, Captain, please take me back to the place where you found me. With a glint in his eye and a kind-hearted sigh, he said, girl, I'm gonna break this to you gently. We're at the turning point, and we'll never, ever, ever return. We're at the turning point. You can only bring along the lessons you learn. We're at the turning point. You really need to know you're never going back home. We're at the turning point. I can only tell you that you're never alone. Don't, do, 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 da, 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 do, 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 da, da. Da, da. The next morning I woke, we were still in the boat, and the ocean was so still and forgiving. While the air was clear, I shed one more tear, then I tore away the lie I'd been living. Then the healing came in the captain's name. Yeah, he carried all my sorrow and grief for me. So I took his hand and we took our stand as we faced the second half of my history. Yeah. We're at the turning point, and we'll never, ever, ever return. We're at the turning point. You can only bring along the lessons you learn. We're at the turning point. You really need to know you're never going back home. We're at the turning point. I can only tell you that you're never alone. Do, 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 do. Da, 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 da. So we won't look back, and we don't look back, and we're never, ever, ever returning. No, we don't look back, and we won't look back, and we're bringing all the lessons we're learning. No, we won't look back, and we don't look back, and we're never, ever, ever returning.
So we won't look back, and we don't look back, and we're bringing all the lessons we're learning. We're at the turning point, and we'll never, ever, ever return. We're at the turning point. You can only bring along the lessons you learn. We're at the turning point. You really need to know we're never going back home. We're at the turning point. I can only tell you that you're never alone. Do, 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 do.